Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I'm doing my November wrap-up, so these are going to be all of the books that I read in November. Last month I read 12 books, which I was really happy about, and also in November I reached 100 books read this year, which is way past my original goal. My original goal I think was set at 50 books, and so at this point, since I still got a little time left, I'm trying to see how much further I can get with it, and I'm kind of hoping that I might be able to get to 120 books. But November was a pretty good reading month. There were one or two books that really stood out for the most part, though. The rest of the month was kind of like in the middle, books that I enjoyed. I don't think there was anything that I really hated, so it was mostly things that were kind of like in the middle and like nice with one or two standouts. But let's get started. So the first thing that I read in November was actually a graphic novel, which was Fence Volume 1 by C.S. Pacat, and this is about a fencing team. It follows a boy who has just come to a new school. He's hoping to get a fencing scholarship, and he's trying out to get onto the fencing team. And then there's some drama. There's someone who might be his like long lost half brother or something, and this one I've been wanting to read more graphic novels. I'm not really a graphic novel person. I don't read a lot of them, but this year I've been trying out more of them, so I decided to just pick this one up and test it out. I don't think this is one that I'm going to continue with, though. I wasn't that interested in the characters. It didn't really pull me in, and I wasn't really that interested in like what was going on with him trying to get on the fencing team. There didn't seem to be a lot of plot in the first volume, and I wasn't really interested in the characters, so there wasn't anything really like keeping me there, but I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. The next book that I finished in November was Maresi by Maria Turchaninov, and this is the first book in the Red Abbey Chronicles. So this is a fantasy book that I think was originally written in Finnish and then translated to English. I actually heard about this from Kara's channel, Wild Book Garden, and this is kind of a quieter fantasy. It follows these two girls who live at an abbey on an island, and the religion that they follow in this fantasy world is kind of like a triple goddess type religion, where it has the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And the two girls that we're following, they both are kind of escaping things from their past. One of them is escaping an abusive family, and the other one is escaping famine. And the two of them find each other at this abbey, and they become really close friends. And I really enjoyed this one. The first half and the second half do feel different. The first half, as I said, is very quiet and very much focuses on like building this world, and we really are following like the day-to-day lives of the women who live at this abbey, and we're following the two of these girls as they are becoming friends, and they love reading, so they spend a lot of time in the library together, and it's just like a very sweet friendship between the two of them. And then in the second half, one of them, something from their past kind of comes back to haunt them, and then they have to protect the abbey from intruders. Overall, I really enjoyed this. I like that it was just this kind of quiet, sweet fantasy, especially in the first half, and then it focuses on, you know, the friendship between these two girls and the relationships of the women at this abbey, and I do like that kind of focus on the day-to-day lives of the abbey, and it's just very, like, the first half of it I feel like is very soothing in that way. There were a few things in this that I felt like didn't quite make sense, especially in the second half. There were certain things that I just felt like people reacted to things in ways that didn't make sense. I'd be like, that's not how a person would react in this situation. And then sometimes the explanation was like because of the magic that happens with the goddesses. But I didn't feel like the magic was really explained, so it felt a little bit like a crutch, like that they could just go like because magic, instead of really explaining like why people were behaving in a way that like didn't quite make sense. But I do feel like that was kind of like a minor detail of it. I did think the magic was interesting. I really actually wanted more about the magic because I thought it was really interesting, the different powers and abilities that were kind of associated with each of the goddesses. I would have liked to know more about their practices and their ritual, and I especially would have loved to know more about the crone magic because there's only a little bit about it in this, and I thought that was like one of the most interesting parts of it. So I really would have loved to see more crone magic. So as I said, overall, I really enjoyed this. There were just like a couple of things that were a little off for me, and there were a few things that I kind of just wanted more from it. But I liked this one a lot, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read a book of poetry, which was Edge of Wonder by Victoria Erickson. And this one, I enjoyed some parts of it. There were a few poems that I really liked that were kind of like good nuggets. But overall, it wasn't a poetry collection that I really liked the whole way through. The next book that I read was Ink Death by Cornelia Funk, and I listened to this one on audiobook actually, but this is a middle grade book that follows Mo and Maggie, who are a father and daughter, who have an ability to read objects and people out of books. So when they read out loud, they can pull characters and objects out of the books that they are reading from. In the first book, it starts in the real world and they are pulling characters from a fictional book world into the real world. In the later books, we do get some perspectives from inside these fictional book worlds. And this one was primarily set inside one of the book worlds. And I really enjoyed this. I felt like we always are learning more about this world, and so I enjoyed how this expanded on the world and expanded on the magic. I think this was a really good conclusion to the story. I did feel like it was a little bit long, but I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Call Down the Hawk by Maggie Stiefvater. This just came out in November, and it was one of my highly anticipated releases of the year because this is the first book in the Dreamer trilogy, which is a new trilogy by Maggie Stiefvater that takes place after the Raven Cycle, following some of the same characters. We're focusing specifically on Ronan and the Lynch family in this. And this I did enjoy because I enjoy Maggie Stiefvater's writing and I do enjoy these characters, but it's definitely not my favorite thing that I've read by her. For one thing, Adam is not in this enough. He's in it a little bit, but he's definitely not in it enough. I went into this, you know, kind of trying to manage my expectations and not really expecting to love it as much as the Raven Cycle, because I know that Ronan is not my favorite character from the Raven Cycle. I like him, but he is definitely not my favorite character, and since this was primarily focused on him and his family, I just knew that it wasn't going to be like my favorite, although I was hoping that since it was focusing on Ronan that Adam would be in it more, and he just wasn't, and I'm just gonna be bitter about it forever because I just want more Adam content. Anyways, in this we're following multiple perspectives. We have actually quite a few perspectives and quite a few new perspectives and new characters that we're introduced to. In this we are learning more about how this dreamer magic works, and we do get to meet other dreamers, which is really interesting. We don't really get any answers about how the magic works, but we get some new like hints and some new information. And then there is also a plot that's kind of like a doomsday end of the world plot that's happening alongside it. Of the new characters that were introduced in this one, I was really only interested in Jordan and her story, but I really loved that we got perspectives from Declan because he was always very like mysterious, I feel like, in the Raven Cycle, and in this one he actually became probably one of my favorite characters in this book, and I think that he's going to be really interesting to learn more about, so I'm really interested in the rest of the series to see like where his character goes and what we learn about him, because he's kind of weird and I really want to know more about him. Right now I'm kind of debating as to whether I'm going to make like a review or maybe a spoiler discussion of this, because I think I want to talk more kind of in depth or a little more detailed about what I thought worked or didn't work about this one, but overall, of course, I'm going to be continuing this series, and I did like this. It just like didn't blow me away, although I really wasn't expecting it to, and I gave this 3.5 stars. The next book that I read was 7 Practices of a Mindful Leader by Mark Lesser. This is a book about using mindfulness for leadership, how to use mindfulness practices to be a better leader or increase like other leadership skills, especially things like emotional intelligence, self-awareness, things like that. I read this partially just out of interest, but also because I was reading it for some research that I was doing. I was doing a project for one of my classes about using mindfulness practices in leadership development and trainings. And this one I thought was interesting. It had some definitely like good nuggets of information that I was able to use for my paper, which was great. But I think that for me, I think this focused too much actually on the mindfulness side and too much on just like kind of general benefits of mindfulness, what is mindfulness, that kind of thing, and not as much about how mindfulness relates to leadership and how you can apply it to like leadership situations or how being a leader. So I felt like it did well on like pitching mindfulness as a good thing and like explaining what mindfulness is and the benefits you can get out of it. But I feel like it needed to make a better connection between the mindfulness practices and then how do you use them to become a better leader. Next, I read another graphic novel, which was Wires and Nerve by Marissa Meyer. This is following Aiko from the Lunar Chronicles, and it's taking place after the events of the Lunar Chronicles series. And it's following Aiko as she is helping, oh wow, I just forgot her name. I don't know. I don't remember what the main characters from Cinder. The book is named after her. Okay. It's following Aiko as she is helping Cinder, or Cinder has sent her on this like special mission. I didn't really like this graphic novel that much. I didn't think that the story was that interesting. It got a little more interesting towards the end, but for most of it, it felt like it was really dragging, and it's like, it's not even that long. It's a very short graphic novel, and it still felt like it was dragging its feet. But also, I really didn't like the art style of this one. It wasn't an art style that I liked looking at, but also pretty much everybody looked the same. Most of the characters really looked the same, and it was really hard to tell most of them apart, which just doesn't work well for a graphic novel. So I didn't really like this one. I think there are more in this series. I think there are more graphic novels, but I don't think I'm going to be reading any more of them. Next, I read The Highland Witch by Susan Fletcher. This is a historical fiction novel that takes place in Scotland in 1692. It takes place after a famous massacre that happened in the Highlands of Scotland. And we're following a character in this named Corag, who has been accused of witchcraft. She is one of the only survivors from this massacre, and she is now imprisoned awaiting her death. And while she is waiting, I think an Irish reverend shows up. He is trying to collect some information about this massacre to help him politically, but since she is one of the only survivors that they know of, he wants to interview her to find out what happened at this massacre and who was involved. She agrees to help him, but she says first he has to listen to her whole life story because she has no other family, and when she dies, there won't be anybody in the world to remember her. So she agrees to help him if he will listen to her life story. So that is what this book is. So it's kind of told in two ways. One half of it is her telling her life story and like narrating it, starting from like birth up through the massacre. And then the other part of it is the Reverend and he's writing letters back to his wife back home. And this, I think I'm going to be doing a full review for this because I have more to say about it. But overall, I did enjoy this one. It is not a happy story because she has a very difficult life. She's very much on her own and, persecuted because a lot of people do accuse her of witchcraft. And then of course it like culminates in a massacre. So this is not a like fun book, but I did think that it was really well written. It definitely has like atmosphere to it, and you can really feel the atmosphere of like being in the Scottish Highlands, which I really appreciated. I don't necessarily like the way that it was told in that format of her telling her story and then the letters. I think that the like telling my story kind of device is really difficult to do well, and it's not one that I generally like. I also felt like it was kind of awkward because it was one-sided. When we were reading from her perspective, sometimes she would be talking to the Reverend, but we never heard his side of the conversation. So it was kind of like listening to like, one side of a phone call, when you just kind of have to assume or like figure out what the other person is saying based on the answers. So that was always like kind of awkward and weird. But then once she would dive into just telling her story instead of like having a conversation, it got a lot better when it was just storytelling. Then as far as the letters go, I mean, I wasn't that interested in the letters. I did think it was interesting to see his thoughts and feelings kind of shifting over time. But again, the like letters kind of format is not my favorite for storytelling. So I think there was a lot about the format of it that didn't really work for me. But I thought that the atmosphere of it was really great, and the character was really interesting. The main character, Korag, she's a very interesting character. She's gone through a lot in her life, but she's still a very like compassionate person. She is a healer, which I always love healers in stories. Also, there is kind of a romance in this, and like it is and it isn't important to the story. I just was not invested in the romance. I could not get into it. I feel like if it was going to be like really important and emotional, I would have wanted more time spent on developing the romance, but also I didn't like it because the man that she's in love with is married. So it was just like hard for me to get on board with this romance. I just was like not into it, but I thought this one was pretty good. I gave it 3.75 stars. It wasn't quite at 4, but overall I thought it was really good. Then I read Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett, and this one was a bit of like a roller coaster for me. I actually started it the month before and got about 170 pages into it and just put it down because I was not liking it. And then in November, I picked it back up as an audiobook, and then I loved it. So the first part of this, the reason I put it down initially was because, one, I just feel like I couldn't get into his writing style. I don't think it's poorly written by any means. I think it's just not a style that really works for me. I didn't really like the way the dialogue was written in this. It felt kind of awkward, which is part of why I thought it would work better as an audiobook, because sometimes dialogue that feels awkward to read sounds better when someone's actually speaking it out loud, and I think that was definitely the case for this. But also one of the things that was tough for me with this is that it jumps right in with a lot of action and then a lot of like world building, very focused on building the magic system, but not a lot of focus on the characters. And since I'm a very character driven reader, I just like couldn't really get into it because I was like, yeah, I'm seeing all of these characters like doing all this action and running around, but like, why do I care? I don't know them, so I don't really care what they're doing. So that was part of what was tough for me. But again, as an audiobook, it was a little bit easier to just like keep going and push through the part that was mostly action and world building to get to the part that was more about the characters. I guess I should probably explain what this is about. This takes place in a magical world that is ruled by merchant houses, and it's kind of lawless. They just sort of, they don't have exact laws, they just sort of have the ways that they don't step on each other's toes so they don't like break out in war. And we're following two main characters, Sanchia, who is a thief, and Dandolo, who is like a lawman. So Sanchia, who is a thief, she has an assignment to steal something, and she doesn't really know what it is, but then she decides to actually like look at what she stole, and it turns out to be a magical talking key. And then that kind of takes off the story and gets her wrapped up in things that she was not prepared to be a part of. And then Dandolo is initially trying to track her down because she is a thief, but then the two of them learn that there is a larger plot conspiracy problem, possibly world-ending situation happening, and they become unlikely allies, and then they pull in some other unlikely allies as well. I think that the world building in this is done really well, and the magic system is really unusual and really interesting. It has this kind of scribing magic. They call it scriving, but it's this kind of written magic which uses like logical backbends to rewrite the laws of reality and physics. It's difficult to like really explain until you read this. I did sometimes feel like he would like explain and re-explain and over-explain the magic system a little bit, but to some extent that was necessary because it is a very like particular like intricate magic system in a lot of ways, and I just think it was a really interesting one. But then the second half of the book was really good, and we got more invested in the characters, learned more about them, so I was much more invested in that way. But also the plot really picked up. It kind of took half of the book to get to the plot. There's a lot of like stuff happening, because it ends up being kind of a heist story, but for heists there's always that kind of like build up where you're like assembling the team and like figuring out how you're going to do the heist and all of that. And that's pretty much the first half of the book, and then the second half is when like stuff actually happens. But that second half was so good. Like, it got to a point where I was just like, I cannot put this down, and I just was like, it was so good. And after I finished this book, I just couldn't think about anything else. I kept thinking about it for like, you know, 2 days afterwards, and I felt like I couldn't read any other book. The first half was kind of a 3 stars, the second half was kind of like 5 stars, and so overall I gave this 4 stars. The second book to this is coming out in 2020, and now I'm really excited for it, especially since now that I already know these characters and I'm invested in them, if it just like dives right into the action, I think I'm gonna be way more into it. Then I read another poetry book, which was 1,000 Mornings by Mary Oliver, and I really love Mary Oliver's poetry. This one was also just beautiful, as all of her poetry books are. So I really enjoyed this. Then I finally read The Wicked Deep by Shea Earnshaw. I've been meaning to read this for so long, and it's just been sitting on my shelf. I actually ended up picking this up as an audiobook, and this is about a small town called Sparrow, which in its history, at one point there were 3 sisters who were accused of witchcraft and drowned, and now every year in the summer, these 3 sisters come back, their spirits come back and take over the bodies of 3 girls in the town and use their bodies to lure boys to their deaths in the harbor. And the people of this town have kind of come to accept this horror that is a part of their lives. The main character, Penny, lives on an island that is part of the town and has a lighthouse. But one day when the swan season, which is what they call the time when these sisters come and take over the bodies of the girls. When the swan season begins, a boy comes into town, and Penny decides that she wants to save him because she thinks that one of the sisters will try to lure him to his death in the harbor as well. In a lot of ways actually felt like a Holly Black book, which I thought was interesting. It had a very similar vibe to it to me. So if you really like Holly Black's books, you probably would like this one also. It definitely had some insta-love in it that was kind of frustrating. I thought that the main male character was kind of dumb, or like he did things that I was just like, why would you make that decision? Although that was like a lot of the characters in this. While I was reading this, there was something that I had been thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if like this was the plot twist? And then that I turned out to be right, and that was the plot twist. But then when it happened, I was kind of disappointed with the way that it was done. So I feel like this one was pretty like mediocre and kind of disappointing to me. But I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And the last book that I read in November was The Complete Enneagram, 27 Paths to Greater Self-Knowledge by Beatrice Chestnut. So this is a nonfiction book about the Enneagram, which is a personality assessment. I've had this one on my shelf for quite a while and been meaning to read it, but never quite got around to it because it's a little bit chunky and it's nonfiction. But I recently read this because I was doing research for a video that I posted, which was about the Enneagram types of the characters from the Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater. I'll link it below if you're interested in watching that. I really love that video. I just recently posted it. But I was reading this as part of my research to kind of try and figure out which types those characters are. And I really liked this book. I think that it does a really good job of talking about the types. It does a good job of talking about the instinctual subtypes. And I also think one of the things I liked best about it is that it does a good job of talking about like the nuances of difference between 2 types, or between types that may seem similar, so that you can kind of figure out like the slight differences in motivation, especially for like behaviors that may look similar. So I thought this one was really interesting and really helpful, and this may be my new favorite Enneagram book. I don't know. So those are all of the books that I read in November. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!